Recently, I was looking over a list of statues and outdoor sculptures in the 5 boroughs of the city of New York. And what I discovered is that this area is considered the greatest outdoor public art museum in the United States. There are over 300 outdoor sculptures and statues in the 5 boroughs, with obviously the Statue of Liberty being the most famous. But some of the more notable ones include sculptures of George Washington and Benjamin Franklin and John Watts and Nathan Hale from the Revolutionary War period, and newspaper people like Horace Greeley and William Jennings Bryan, and many military figures such as Tecumseh Sherman and Phil Sheridan. And of course, there's plenty of statues about politicians like Al Smith and Mayor LaGuardia and Eleanor Roosevelt and Samuel Tilden and Abraham Lincoln. And there are sculptures of people from outside our country like Christopher Columbus and Simone Bolivar and Ludwig van Beethoven and Mahatma Gandhi. There's even a sculpture of Vladimir Lenin on Houston Street between Avenues A and B. Did you know there was a statue of Lenin in New York City? I didn't know that. There are sculptures of religious people like St. Elizabeth Ann Seton and Patrick Joseph Hayes and Confucius and Joan of Arc and others. But on this list of best-known sculptures in the 5 boroughs of New York City, there was one person I didn't see on the list: Jesus of Nazareth. Now, I'm sure probably in front of churches and inside churches and museums and other things, there's plenty of statues and monuments and other things. But I think it's just as well that there's not very many statues of Jesus in the 5 boroughs of New York City, because I think it's more important to think of Jesus as a moving figure than as a statue. Jesus moved, statues stand. And so I think today we need to think of Jesus as that moving figure. We see Jesus do that today in our scripture reading for Palm Sunday, the triumphal entry into Jerusalem. And as you heard today, Jesus orchestrated his own parade. Instead of just walking into the city with his disciples, he had his followers go into town and find a young colt so that he could come riding into town on a symbol of peace that came from the prophet Zechariah, that talked about the reigning king will come in peace riding on a young colt. And so Jesus came riding in with his group of about 120 followers. But he wanted to get a little bit of attention because, after all, it was Passover week. And so normally the city of Jerusalem, that was about 40,000 people at the time, would swell to 200,000 during this week as pilgrims would come to celebrate Passover in the holy city. And so Jesus wanted to gather a little attention. Now what we heard today was that in Mark's gospel, he comes into town, walks into the temple, looks around, and leaves. But by the time you get to the next written gospel, Matthew, that's not good enough for Matthew. He has to have Jesus come in right away and to chase out the money changers and the merchants and to make a scene. In Mark's gospel, that happens the next day when Jesus comes back. Jesus comes back and drives out the money changers and the merchants and says, "My house is a house of prayer." And what he's talking about at the time is that at that moment in history, the temple had become both the seat of government and a place of worship. And so he was calling for a call for worship. So see, we have a little bit of an issue here today as we think about the the coming of Jesus, Jesus seemed to come to Jerusalem with a message. He came with a message looking for justice. And all he seemed to be wanting to do was to ask the people, the religious authorities, who were also the political authorities at the time, to implement what he knew as the reign of God, as he read about it in the Hebrew Scriptures. That it was to bring in the ways of God that had been set down in the Hebrew Scriptures long ago of how to be a fair and just society. As Marcus Borg and Dominic Crossan, in their book that they wrote 10 years ago called The Last Week, they wrote, "The first passion of Jesus was the kingdom of God, namely to incarnate the justice of God by demanding for all a fair share of a world belonging to and ruled by the covenantal God of Israel. It was that first passion for God's distribution justice that led inevitably to the second passion by Pilate's punitive justice, to narrow the passion of Jesus to his last 12 hours, arrest, trial, and torture and crucifixion, is to ignore the connection between his life and his death." So what the writers of this book remind us is that there was an interesting thing that happened on that Holy Week almost 2,000 years ago. On that week of Passover, Jesus and his band of 120 people came in the east gate of the city of Jerusalem, shouting, "Hosanna to the highest, Hosanna to the King of Kings, Hosanna to the one coming in the image of King David," and talking about justice and fairness in the land. On that same day, on the west gate, came another parade, a parade of soldiers of Pilate's army that's sent from Rome. Rome already had a garrison of soldiers that were stationed in Jerusalem, but at Passover time, another garrison would come up from the sea to reinforce the garrison that was there, to remind the people of who was in charge. And so they came into town with their drums beating and their leather moving and their horses and their armor and their spears and their swords and their shiny eagles, marching into town, bringing a different message, a message of domination. You see, by the time of Jesus' time, but about the time Jesus was a child, things had changed dramatically in Israel. Israel had moved from agrarian culture to a more not industrial, but more of an organization that was ruled by large plantations. And Jesus seemed to be talking about wanting to honor what the Hebrew Scriptures talked about, that every son and man of the Hebrew faith had the right to a piece of land in Israel. And that every 50 years there was to be a Jubilee year where debts were wiped away, and it was supposed to bring kind of equity back into the system, and so that there would be more justice and fairness in the land. But by the time Jesus was an adult, that had all gone away. Rome had conquered Israel. They needed the land bridge between their holdings in Europe and their holdings in northern Africa. And they collaborated with people they could trust, wealthy families in Israel, to run the country in their stead. They didn't really care much about the Hebrew religion. All they wanted was stability and their tribute to be paid. And everything in life has a cause and effect. So as there was more tribute asked for and more needed, there was more going to the top and less at the bottom. And so there was more debt and there was more disruption. And so for those 70 years from the time Jesus was a child until 40 years after his death, there was basically oppression, rebellion, war, and final destruction. And the cycle went on and on and on until it ended with that beautiful temple being burnt to the ground and the city being destroyed. At the time, considered one of the most beautiful at that time. All because of a system that held people down. See, my friends, we have a little bit of a dilemma today. Our dilemma is that we raise our palm branches, which I was going to hold up, but it just fell off the pulpit. Thank you, John. We raise our palm branches and we sing Hosanna. Hosanna to the King of Kings. And we like the good news that brings because it brings hope and love and joy and grace. But Jesus also brings a message of justice and fairness and equity in the land. And it invites us to join the parade for that message. And so the question for us today is, 2,000 years ago, would we have joined the parade? Now, we're sitting in a Christian church and we'd like to think, well, of course we would have. We would have joined in, or we at least would have been in the crowd sympathizing and raising our branches in support. But would we? 2,000 years ago, in order to get ahead, you had to be employed by one of the wealthy families of the people of Israel in order to have a job, in order to provide for your family. And so you became part of the system that allowed things to keep going to the top, and little coming to the bottom, and all the repression and violence and pain that went with it. And so today we sit here with a dilemma. Would we join the parade? Would we be part of the call for a fair and just society? Well, fortunately for us, hopefully, we have ways that we can do that because we hopefully think we live in a more free society where we can make choices and we can vote our wishes and we can live in a more just land. But we're all very well aware that as we come out of recession, things seem not to be flowing back down to the bottom very much. And there's a sense that there's a widening and widening of who we are as a people and what we have or we don't have. And we struggle with that because we want to provide for our own well-being and for our own family. But every time we wave that palm branch, we also say, well, what about the other? What about the ones that still need a helping hand? Marcus Borg and Dominic Crossan make a very, very good point in their book when they wrote that they assumed that most of the people in Jerusalem were very ethical and hardworking people. But they were part of a system that was not life-giving and that was oppressive and that finally came to an end. And so we remind ourselves that we live in a system where it's and they also go on to talk about how when you think about the system that the people were living in at the time, when you look at all of history, that was normal. That was the normal system of how it worked. And we know it still works today. The thing that we remind ourselves as Christians is that our forefathers and mothers brought a different way, brought a way to give people a chance and put things in place so that there would be a chance of equity and a sense of dignity and respect in the world. But it's so tempting not to have that system because if you look at history, it's not normal. It hasn't been normal. And so we struggle. I noticed this week that the majority of our congressmen and men and women in Congress have decided that it doesn't seem to be normal that we have a Medicare system where the old are guaranteed health insurance. And it's suggested that we go to a system where at 85 you have to go back out and try to find insurance with a voucher, knowing that eventually that voucher will not keep up with the rise of medical expenses, meaning that someday an older person will not have insurance. But it's so tempting because when things get tight, we always want to take a little bit more away from the young and the old and the sick and make it somebody else's problem. It's our problem. All there is us. So when we think about all the statues and monuments and sculptures in the city of New York City, we also remember one other thing today. There's something else that New York is known for. They held the very first Labor Day parade in 1884. A call for dignity and fairness for sharing the bounty of hard work. As a matter of fact, one of the historical facts is that it's a possibility that the idea of the first Labor Day parade came from Paterson, New Jersey. We have a system that allows us to raise our voice. And we belong to a church that has always looked out for the young, the old, the sick, and the forgotten. And to be that voice, to say, let's remember everybody. There's just us. We all get a helping hand one way or the other. That's what we do as Americans. That's what we do as people of faith. So I invite you to grab your palm. And we sang a song today that said, ride on to majesty. And we see that both as a song of inspiration and as a song that causes a dilemma. And as we struggle what it means to be a just society and a just person, it reminds us that we're asked to make just decisions and be fair in everything we do, in our homes, in our businesses, in our communities, and in our world. For Jesus invites us to always remember the other, because we're called to love our neighbors as we love ourselves. So our call today is, Hosanna! Hosanna! Hosanna in the highest! Let us join the parade. Shall we stand for our closing hymn as we turn our attention to Holy Week?